Live on a Washington, D.C. stage, Karoline Leavitt leans into the mic and scoffs, "America doesn't need survivors. It needs winners." As Jasmine Crockett stands beside her, applause erupts, then vanishes when a young black student in the back row rises, clutching a crumpled letter no one ever expected to hear, shredding the neat grit versus gifted debate in seconds. Within minutes, the broadcast detonates into a media firestorm, threatening the mocker's career and igniting a nationwide wave of raw, handwritten confession letters. And when the studio lights cut out, one question slashes through the silence. Who truly falls? The one who tells the truth, or the one too afraid to listen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio was ice cold under the hot lights. Face the Divide, live from Washington, D.C., wasn't just another political show. It was a televised collision course. 60 audience members formed a perfect arc around the stage, seated like silent jurors. Overhead, cameras hovered, ready to catch blood. On the screen behind them, grit versus gifted. What truly defines success in America? The title burned like a challenge. The crowd was tense, unmoving. Phones were silent. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was personal. Karoline Leavitt walked in first, polished, confident, and dressed for a fight. Her presence screamed order, control, superiority. She believed success came from structure, not struggle. To her, resilience was just a fancy word for excuse. She waved like a victor before the battle even started, her side of America already applauding. Then Jasmine Crockett appeared. No smile, no flash, no need. Just quiet defiance wrapped in a dark dress. Every step she took was a reminder. She didn't arrive through legacy. She clawed her way here. The room shifted. Applause was lighter but deeper, coming from those who recognized what it took to survive with nothing. She didn't sit to perform. She sat to expose. The host leaned in. "Tonight we ask, does greatness come from privilege or pain?" Cameras tightened on Jasmine's face. No blink, no flinch. Somewhere, someone in the control room whispered, "Something's about to happen." Because this wasn't debate anymore. This was reckoning. And just when the room began to settle, Karoline leaned forward, smiling like a blade, and delivered a line sharp enough to split the air in half. "I don't believe in overcoming hardship," she said, slowly, deliberately, like each word was a scalpel slicing through fabric. Her tone wasn't emotional, it was cold, polished, built for silence. She wasn't just making a point, she was sending a message. That phrase, to me, is nothing more than the language of people who want to justify failure. She paused, just long enough for the weight of it to land. America doesn't need people who've fallen and gotten back up. America needs people strong enough not to fall in the first place. The words didn't land. They exploded. A beat of stillness, then a fracture in the room. Applause came fast, but not from everyone. The first claps were sharp, certain, from the front left section. Suits, tight ties, folded hands now unfolding in satisfaction. It wasn't just support, it was a kind of pride, as if they'd been waiting for someone to finally say it, unfiltered, brutal, unashamed. A few nodded with smug agreement, their smiles thin and triumphant. But not everyone followed. In the middle rows, a few audience members exchanged glances. Others sat frozen, arms crossed tighter, the energy in their bodies shifting from passive to restless. A man in the second row coughed once, deliberately. A woman near the edge blinked hard, her lips tightening as if something inside her recoiled. And on stage, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She didn't reach for the mic. She simply looked at Karoline and held her gaze. But it wasn't a stare of defiance. It was something more unsettling. It was the gaze of someone who had already lived through what the other woman was only theorizing. Jasmine had heard this argument before. Just not in a studio, not with stage lights. She'd heard it when she was 16 and told her GPA wasn't representative. When her landlord raised the rent by $200 with no notice. When her white classmate with lower scores got into law school first because of a more polished essay. This wasn't new, it was just louder. But Jasmine had learned something Karoline hadn't. You don't have to interrupt someone's illusion when you know it's already cracking from within. So she stayed still, like a storm just before the sky rips open. Then, camera 3 moved, quietly, almost instinctively. Not to Jasmine, not to Caroline, but to the back row. There in the outermost curve of the semicircle, a young black woman sat perfectly still. No older than 19. Her white blouse gleamed softly under the studio lights, but her expression was locked in quiet intensity. Her spine was straight, her chin level, her eyes fixed on Jasmine, not blinking, not drifting, not once, as if she were holding her breath. In her lap was a folded piece of paper, 3 creases, corners slightly torn, not decorative, not crisp. It was a letter, aged from being carried too long, maybe inside a backpack, maybe inside a drawer, maybe under a pillow. The kind of letter you write but never send. The kind of truth you don't know where to place. She wasn't part of the panel. She wasn't on any guest list. But something about her presence, silent, focused, unshakable, pulled the lens in. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't whisper to anyone nearby. She didn't need to. Her face said it all. This moment mattered to her in a way no one else in the room understood. Because Caroline's words weren't just theory to her. They were bullets aimed at people she loved, maybe at herself. And Jasmine, though facing forward, seemed to know the girl was there, like she felt her through the silence. On stage, Caroline adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and leaned back in her chair, satisfied. She thought she had landed the punch. Thought Jasmine's stillness meant she had nothing to say. She mistook discipline for defeat. That was her first mistake. Because Jasmine's silence wasn't surrender. It was readiness. It wasn't hesitation. It was calibration. Karoline had dropped a soundbite. Jasmine was holding a story, one she knew how to aim. Across the room, the girl with the folded letter still hadn't moved. But her grip on the paper was tighter now, fingertips whitening. She wasn't watching a debate. She was watching to see if someone like her would be allowed to exist in this space without apology, without translation, without trimming herself down to be acceptable. And Caroline had no idea. She had no idea that the most dangerous voice in the room wasn't Jasmine. It was the one that hadn't spoken yet. Jasmine exhaled slowly, just once, then sat forward, barely an inch. The kind of movement that doesn't look like much, but anyone who'd grown up around violence, of any kind, would recognize it instantly. Something was about to strike, and this time, it wouldn't miss. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean back or lash out. She simply leaned in. And when she spoke, the air in the room changed. Not from heat, from history. I was 14 when my mother came home with a plastic bag and a pink slip. She began, her voice low but unmistakably clear. The bag had 2 loaves of bread, a carton of eggs, and a note from the HR department saying she was no longer needed. That was the day I stopped being a kid. She paused, not for effect, but because some memories aren't meant to be said fast. We had $27 left and rent due in 4 days. That night, while some kids were worrying about homework, I was in a stranger's office, scrubbing coffee stains off a mahogany desk I'd never be allowed to sit behind. Her eyes didn't drift from Caroline. I wasn't chasing a dream. I was trying to keep the lights on. She shifted slightly in her seat, not to adjust, but as if the story she was about to tell needed more room in her chest to be said aloud. Lunch became 2 slices of bread with ice cubes in between. We didn't even have peanut butter, just cold starch and hope the bread didn't go moldy before Friday. The room had gone still, dead still. My little brother studied on the floor under the window, not because it was comfortable, but because the street lamp outside was our only light source after 7 p.m., and when it rained, he had to stop. Not because he was tired, but because the light disappeared. She looked around the room now, slowly without blinking. I didn't grow up knowing what extra credit was. I knew what late fees were. I knew what it meant when your landlord slipped a folded notice under the door without knocking. I learned how to read lease agreements before I learned how to balance equations. Because one mistake, one misunderstood clause, could mean sleeping in a different zip code the next day. Her hands didn't move, but her voice sharpened. You talk about people who never fall. That's privilege talking. I didn't fall because I was careless. I fell because the ground beneath me was never solid to begin with. Her tone didn't rise, but the tension did. You call my story an excuse. I call it a resume, not the one I print on nice paper. The one that taught me how to survive rooms like this. Rooms that look down on people like me before they've even said a word. She inhaled once, deeply, then continued. My education didn't come in a straight line. It came in nights I couldn't sleep because the roaches in our apartment came out when the heat went off. It came from translating every piece of legal paper our family received because my mother never made it past the 10th grade. I learned what predatory lending meant the day we lost our second car. I learned what due process meant when the school suspended my brother for not having the right uniform. She turned back to Caroline now, her eyes steady. So no, I didn't go to school to get a gold star or a framed degree for a wall we couldn't afford to hang pictures on. I went to school because I was tired of not understanding the fine print that let people lie to my mother's face and still win. Her voice dipped lower, more focused. I didn't go to class for applause. I went so I'd never again stand in front of a landlord who told me rent had gone up and pretend to understand why. Then she said it, the sentence that hit like a final gavel. I didn't learn so I could get an A. She paused. I learned so we wouldn't get evicted again because I didn't understand what we were signing. A long silence followed. But it wasn't awkward. It was earned. The kind of silence that follows testimony, not commentary. Something raw, unpolished, but irrefutable. In the back row, the young black woman with the folded letter didn't move. But something in her posture shifted, just enough to say, yes, that's what I came here for. Her fingers tightened around the paper in her lap. She wasn't crying. She was bracing, as if the truth she had lived was finally being said out loud, and her body needed to hold still so she wouldn't fall apart. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't need to. She'd already spoken for her. Across the stage, Caroline's expression had changed. Her arms weren't folded anymore. Her posture wasn't relaxed, because this wasn't a debate now. This was exposure. Jasmine hadn't offered a defense. She had delivered a verdict, and somewhere in that moment, the balance of the room tilted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. But before the weight of Jasmine's story could truly land, before the silence could settle into the ribs of the room, Caroline leaned forward, her voice cold, clinical, and void of even the pretense of empathy. Sure, she said, her smile tight and sharp. That was moving. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the air like it was designed to end conversations, not contribute to them. But being able to tell a sad story doesn't make someone a leader. It just makes them a survivor. She didn't blink as she delivered it, like someone used to winning not with facts, but with certainty. You say you pulled yourself out of something terrible. I don't doubt it. But if hardship was the path to greatness, then how do you explain the millions of people who went through hell and stayed there? The room tensed, not from disagreement, but discomfort. The kind of discomfort that comes when someone stops debating ideas and starts dismantling dignity. If we measured success by who suffered the most, Caroline continued, we'd be crowning every broke, unemployed person in this country with a medal. But that's not how the world works. Pain doesn't make you qualified. Perseverance isn't proof of leadership. It's just what people do when they don't have better options. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. One man crossed his arms tighter. A woman in the third row glanced away. No one clapped. No one dared. Caroline didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. She was speaking for herself, and to the crowd she knew was watching from screens, not seats. She turned fully toward Jasmine now. The smile was gone, replaced with something far more unsettling, a quiet, deliberate challenge. Let's not confuse surviving with succeeding, she said, her tone flattening. You made it through some rough years, fine. But that doesn't mean you're fit to sit at the table where real decisions are made. There it was. Not an argument, not a response. A dismissal, wrapped in logic, delivered like a verdict. She wasn't criticizing Jasmine's background. She was disqualifying it. It was the kind of moment that didn't make headlines, but made scars. Caroline wasn't just challenging Jasmine's perspective. She was undermining her legitimacy, turning her life into a footnote, treating her resilience not as strength, but as a liability. In Caroline's eyes, Jasmine hadn't earned her seat. She had dragged herself there, and that was somehow less noble, less clean, less deserving. The camera operator instinctively zoomed in, not on Caroline, but on Jasmine. Not because she was speaking, but because she wasn't. She was sitting perfectly still, not frozen, but composed, trained, like someone who had endured far worse words in rooms with far less light. Jasmine didn't look away, didn't blink. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, but her jaw had set, not in anger, in recognition. Because this wasn't new. She had heard this before, in fancier rooms with bigger ceilings and more polished accents. She'd heard it from donors who called her raw and passionate, like those were dirty words. From board members who said, "You're impressive, but maybe not the right tone for national policy." From professors who told her, "People like you should speak more carefully. You don't want to come across as emotional." She'd memorized this move. This was what power did when it felt threatened. It reached for decorum like a weapon and used it to bury people alive. Karoline had just drawn a line through Jasmine's entire life and labeled it insufficient. And for a long, brutal moment, no one said a word. But not everyone was silent inside. In the back row, the young black student with the folded letter still hadn't moved. But something in her face had shifted. Her lips were pressed tight, her knuckles pale where they gripped the edges of that worn paper. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was bracing for the moment she'd seen play out too many times, when someone speaks truth and the world shrugs. But Jasmine didn't shrug. She didn't flinch. She didn't fall for the bait, because she knew. You don't respond to a scalpel with a scream. You wait until it cuts too deep, and then you show them what they hit. And even before Jasmine opened her mouth, the room knew. Caroline hadn't won anything. She had simply stepped onto a wire far thinner than she realized. And beneath it, the truth was waiting, burned in, unshakable, and ready. As Caroline's final words echoed in the sterile silence, and Jasmine sat like a storm wound tight inside stillness, the shift didn't come from the podium, but from the farthest seat in the room where no one had looked all night. She hadn't moved since the show began, not once. But now there was something different about her stillness, something sharpened. The young black student in the back row wasn't adjusting in her seat, wasn't reacting dramatically, but her presence had changed. Her eyes, fixed on Jasmine with unwavering intensity, had narrowed, not in confusion, but in recognition. Not of a talking point, of herself, of something buried and unsaid, now stirring under the weight of words that weren't meant for people like her to survive. Her breathing remained controlled, but there was a tightness to it, as if her ribs were bracing for impact she knew was coming. Slowly, deliberately, her right hand reached into the front pocket of her canvas bag. No one noticed. Not the host, not the panel, not the audience trained to watch the lights, the center, the power. But in her fingers, a worn piece of paper emerged, folded in thirds, yellowed slightly at the edges, the kind of fold that doesn't come from storage, but from being opened, closed, reconsidered, and kept. Her thumb ran over the crease once. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew every word. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of something long carried and never spoken aloud. She placed the letter across her lap with quiet reverence, not like an object, like a vow. Camera 3 caught it, not through instruction, but instinct. The operator didn't zoom fast or frame it like a reveal. He just held the shot, because even through the glass, even from a distance, something in her posture said, "Pay attention, not to me, to what's about to happen." The rest of the room hadn't noticed yet, but the current had shifted. It wasn't in the arguments, it wasn't in the policy, it was in the air, in the silence that began to stretch. Just a little longer than it should have, long enough for truth to take root. This wasn't the kind of moment you script. It was the kind that had been waiting for someone to stop talking long enough for it to begin. The silence that followed Caroline's dismissal was brittle, ready to shatter. And when Jasmine finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She changed the rules. "You think strength means never falling?" Jasmine said, her voice measured. quiet, but carrying a gravity that pulled the room to attention. That's not strength. That's luck. Or insulation. Or both. She didn't blink. Because if you've never been knocked down, it's not because you're strong, it's because someone kept the floor clean for you. Her gaze was locked, not in anger, but in certainty, a kind of emotional precision that made every word feel heavier. I've fallen. I've hit concrete. I've buried my head in a pillow so my little brother wouldn't hear me cry because the rent was late, and I didn't know what else to cut. It felt like Jasmine's final words had sealed the room in silence. But silence, it turned out, was only the beginning. From the very last row, a chair scraped against the floor, softly, but enough to cut through the stillness like a warning bell. No one spoke. No one moved. But all eyes turned. A young black woman, barely 19, shoulders square, hands steady, was now standing. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look for a microphone. She simply stepped into the aisle with a folded sheet of paper pressed flat against her chest, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her white blouse caught the light. Her shoes echoed lightly with each step. And though her face was calm, her eyes were locked forward with the intensity of someone who had waited a long time to be seen. Not noticed, but seen. She stopped 5 feet from the stage. Not quite in the spotlight, not quite in the dark. Her voice, when it came, was clear. Not loud, not forced. Just the kind of voice that only exists when truth has lived inside you too long. I wrote this letter to Representative Jasmine Crockett, she said, holding the paper in both hands, exactly 1 year ago this week. It was part of my college scholarship application, but really it was a letter I never thought anyone would hear. The room was silent, not just listening, but holding still, like the floor itself understood the weight of what was being said. I was 17, living in the back seat of a 2003 Ford Taurus with my mom. She worked nights at a storage facility. We parked behind gas stations, covered the windows with jackets, ate dinner from vending machines or not at all. I didn't have Wi-Fi. I didn't have a desk. I studied by holding cereal boxes under streetlights. I memorized the multiplication table off the back of an old Raisin Bran box someone had thrown away. That was how I prepped for midterms. She swallowed once, but her voice didn't waver. I was told not to talk about any of that in my essay. A guidance counselor said it might make donors uncomfortable, that I should just focus on my goals. But then one night, I saw a video of Jasmine Crockett testifying in Congress. I didn't even know what the hearing was about. I just remember the way she spoke. She didn't clean it up. She didn't shrink herself. She didn't beg anyone to accept her. She looked directly at Jasmine now, not with admiration, but with quiet recognition. You looked like my mom. You sounded like the women I knew, and you weren't apologizing for it. She unfolded the last part of the letter. The paper shook once in her hands, not from nerves, but from something deeper. The vulnerability of reading a sentence you once wrote alone, not knowing if it would ever matter. In that essay, she said, I quoted something you said at the end of a hearing. You said, "We don't overcome hardship to be admired. We overcome it so we never have to wait for someone to hand us value we already had." I copied that down in a notebook with a broken binding. That line made me rewrite my entire essay in one night. I told the truth. For the first time. I didn't hide my story. Her voice dropped lower, not in volume, but in gravity. And I got the scholarship, not because I made people comfortable, but because I finally stopped pretending I wasn't worth anything unless I did. She folded the letter slowly, precisely, the way you do when the words on the page have finally done their job. Then she looked at Jasmine again, this time with nothing left to prove. Thank you, she said simply. No tears, no bow, just truth. And then as calmly as she had come, she returned to her seat, leaving behind not applause, not debate, but something far heavier, proof that Jasmine hadn't just survived. She had lit a path for someone else to follow out of the dark. She returned to her seat in silence, but the echo of her words didn't stop there. They left the room with everyone present, and then somehow, with everyone who wasn't. The video appeared online just past midnight. No fanfare, no trending hashtags, no call to action. Just a quiet post from a nameless account. The title was plain, almost accidental. A student read a letter, and the room went silent. There was no logo, no intro, no opinion. It was exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds of raw footage from camera 3, handheld, slightly off-center, but steady enough to capture everything. A young woman standing in the aisle, a folded piece of paper in her hand, a voice that didn't tremble, a truth that did. There was no music swelling beneath her words, no digital effects, no edits to punch the moment. And yet people couldn't look away. The silence in the room, the breathless, heavy stillness that followed each sentence, somehow made it louder than any speech ever broadcast from a podium. It didn't trend. It didn't need to. The views rose like smoke, quietly, relentlessly. 1,000, then 10,000, then 100,000. No headline screamed, no influencer boosted. It passed from one person to another like a secret they were finally allowed to say out loud. The comment section was unlike anything the internet was used to. No arguments, no insults, just confessions. I watched this 3 times and still can't move. That line about the cereal box, I lived that. I never said it out loud until now. She didn't just read a letter. She gave us permission to tell the truth. One user wrote, "I used to believe I didn't belong in certain rooms. After this, I don't care if I'm invited. I'm walking in." And Jasmine, she didn't retweet the clip. She didn't post a statement. She didn't speak to the press. But her silence wasn't absence. It was presence. Because what the student had said, what she had done, wasn't about Jasmine the politician. It was about every girl who thought she had to hide her hunger behind good grammar. Every student who had memorized words they couldn't afford to write down. Every child who thought overcoming meant being quiet once you made it out. This wasn't a viral moment, it was a rupture. And no one saw it coming because it didn't arrive through power. It arrived through honesty, and it stayed. It didn't start with a trend or a headline. There were no hashtags, no morning show interviews. But in the quiet that followed, something began to shift, not on screens, but in people. In a small public high school just outside Colorado Springs, the change began without announcement. Monday morning, the first bell rang like it always did, echoing down fluorescent lit hallways. But when students entered their first period class, they didn't find a quiz on the board, no attendance check, no syllabus, just a single line written in dry erase marker across the front wall. Write a letter to the person who helped you stand when you didn't think you could. No one spoke at first. The room was unusually quiet, not the restless kind, but the kind you only hear before something personal. Some students stared at the blank page for 5 minutes straight. Others started writing instantly without looking up, as if the sentence had been sitting inside them for years. One girl asked if she could write too. A boy folded his letter 3 times and tucked it into his hoodie pocket before anyone saw. No one asked for spelling checks. No one tried to make their handwriting neater. These weren't assignments. They were truths finally invited out into the light. In another corner of the country, thousands of miles from that classroom, a retired Army sergeant sat alone at his kitchen table in Indiana, watching the video for the 3rd time on his phone. He didn't speak, just opened a drawer, pulled out a thin yellow envelope, and laid its contents carefully on the table. A letter, folded twice, frayed at the edges. The handwriting was crooked, the ink faded. It had been written in purple marker, by a hand too small to grip a pen properly. It said, "I'm sorry I failed my spelling test, but thank you for not being mad. I'll do better next time. Love, your daughter." The letter was 17 years old. He'd kept it in his wallet until the corners fell apart. That morning, he placed it into a new envelope and drove across town to his daughter's house. She was 30 now, married, with a child of her own. She opened the letter, confused at first. Then she cried for a reason she couldn't explain. Not just because of the words she had forgotten, but because her father never had. He posted a photo that night, just his hand, holding the old note. No caption but this: "I gave it back to her today. She forgot writing it. I never did." There was no call to action, no campaign, just people rediscovering pieces of themselves they thought had been erased. It wasn't about Jasmine. It wasn't even about the student anymore. It was about what they unlocked: a quiet reckoning, a nationwide pause, a gentle but unrelenting question rising in kitchens, in classrooms, in nursing homes and train stations. Who helped me stand? And why have I never told them? Because for the first time in a long time, people weren't just remembering their pain. They were remembering who held them when it broke, and how much those hands still mattered. As the ripples spread across classrooms, living rooms, inboxes, and late-night text threads, one question echoed louder than any soundbite. Where was Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't spoken. Not once. Not on air, not on social media, not even in the friendly corners of quiet podcasts that once embraced her voice. She declined every invitation, turned down every cable panel, and walked past every microphone extended in her path. For 3 straight days, her team sent no statements, no acknowledgments, nothing. And in Washington, D.C., a place where silence is often mistaken for weakness, that nothing felt louder than a scandal. Producers speculated, editors waited. Twitter accounts posted screenshots of her last online activity, desperate for a narrative thread. Talking heads on political roundtables filled airtime asking, is she pulling back? Is this a calculated rebrand? A strategic pivot? But the people who needed to hear her weren't asking any of those questions, because those people weren't watching cable news. They were rewatching a student reading a letter. Outside her Capitol Hill office, cameras were posted for 48 hours straight. One intern opened a side door on the second day to bring in boxed lunches, and even that became a trending clip. Inside, the phones rang nonstop, not with criticism, but with confessions, messages, people leaving voicemails they didn't know they needed to leave. I just wanted to say, thank you. I haven't spoken to my father in 11 years. I sent him my letter today. My daughter saw the clip and asked if we could write one together. She's 10. I didn't know she felt that way about me. None of this came from hashtags. None of it was amplified by influencers. It wasn't a movement designed in boardrooms or coordinated by strategists. It was just the aftershock of truth that had been too long contained. And Jasmine, she said nothing. Not because she didn't care, not because she was above it, but because she understood something rare. When a moment becomes bigger than the person who sparked it, speaking again too soon is not leadership, it's ego. And ego was never the engine that drove her through law school on secondhand textbooks, or through campaigns without corporate donors, or through courtrooms where she was told she was too emotional to be trusted with fact. She wasn't performing silence. She was protecting something sacred. By the 4th day, the tension among journalists began to bend toward impatience. Some op-eds accused her of ghosting the public. Others claimed she was manipulating sentiment. One editorial in a conservative outlet accused her of weaponizing poverty for political optics, a line written by someone who had clearly never been hungry long enough to memorize numbers off the back of a cereal box. Still, she didn't respond. No tweet, no filter, not even a post of the letter, which by then had already been printed out and tacked to bulletin boards in schools across the country. Then late Thursday evening, the email arrived. It wasn't addressed to the media. It wasn't sent to verified press contacts or announced through an official briefing. It came from a generic house.gov address with no subject line, no header, no logo, and no attachments. Just 29 words, unformatted, unstyled, but undeniable. I don't need to be remembered. I just need someone, somewhere, someday, to feel strong enough to ask for help and not feel ashamed for doing it. No follow-up, no clarification, no second draft, and somehow that one sentence hit harder than 1,000 press releases ever could. It wasn't humble. It wasn't even soft. It was defiant in its honesty. Because in a world that teaches you to brand your struggle, polish your survival, and monetize your testimony, Jasmine refused. She didn't ask to be celebrated. She asked that someone, anyone, feel less alone. And across the country, people heard her. A high school counselor in Phoenix printed that line and taped it to the door of her office. She didn't tell her students why. She didn't have to. One boy asked to stay after school for the first time in weeks. A girl who never spoke raised her hand in class. In a family therapist's office in rural Kentucky, the quote was printed in 18-point font and placed in the waiting room. By Friday, 5 patients had circled it with a pen. One left a sticky note underneath. "I've needed help since 1997. Today, I said it out loud." At a university in New Jersey, a professor read the line to a lecture hall of exhausted seniors who were drowning in final papers and quietly wondering whether they belonged at all. One student stood up and walked out, not in protest, but to call her mother for the first time since they fought 3 months earlier. In these corners, unseen, unmeasured, unmonetized, Jasmine's words were doing something no algorithm could predict. They were giving people permission, permission to be human, to not know, to ask, to speak without shame, to hurt out loud and still belong. No viral trend was attached, no fundraisers followed, because this wasn't a campaign. This was what truth feels like when it's unbranded, unfiltered, and given away with nothing expected in return. And Jasmine? She went back to work. Back to the hearings that don't get live streamed. Back to casework for families no one writes headlines about. Back to the quiet corners of a broken system where the cameras don't go. But the pain still lives. She didn't walk back into the spotlight. She walked past it, quietly, deliberately, because her work had never been about claiming space. It had always been about making space for others. And if someone, somewhere, someday felt strong enough to raise their hand and ask for help, without apology, without fear, then that one sentence was more than enough. She never needed to be remembered. She just needed someone to believe they were worth remembering themselves. And while Jasmine disappeared from the cameras with purpose, the one who had stood opposite her, sharp, polished, unbending, stepped back onto the stage, unaware that the rules had changed. Karoline Leavitt hadn't been canceled. Her inbox wasn't flooded with threats. Her donors didn't vanish. No petitions were launched, no boycotts announced. She hadn't said anything outrageous enough to provoke national condemnation, at least not by the standards of a media ecosystem trained to reward cruelty dressed as conviction. The headlines moved on. The clip of her performance in Face the Divide was cut, re-uploaded, edited for context, debated online, and then buried under newer controversies. She weathered it like she always did, because Karoline was made for storms, ones she expected, controlled, even invited. But what she didn't expect was what came next. A week later, at a packed auditorium in Des Moines, she stood behind the podium under bright, flattering light, ready to deliver the same tight message she'd practiced for years. Discipline, self-reliance, individual strength. The script was the same. The crowd was familiar. And when the first round of applause rang out as she stepped on stage, she smiled. The air smelled of confidence, of control, of normalcy. But when the Q&A session began, something cracked. A woman in the second row, a school principal with a laminated badge still clipped to her collar, raised her hand and skipped the microphone. "I don't want to know where you went to college," she said. "I want to know who picked you up when you fell." Karoline blinked, just once. She tilted her head slightly, buying time. The crowd didn't laugh, didn't murmur. They waited. Another hand, a younger man in the back, sleeves rolled up. "Not your policies," he said. "Your pain. When you got knocked flat, who showed up?" The questions kept coming. Not hostile, not disrespectful, but different. Not the kind of questions she had prepared bullet points for. They weren't asking for her qualifications. They were asking for her scars. And Karoline had spent a lifetime making sure no one could see those. She smiled again, mechanical this time, deflecting. "We all go through hard things," she said, "but I believe in rising above them, not leaning on others." The words landed, but they didn't settle. Something in the room stayed taut, like a string pulled too tight. A third voice, this time from a teenager sitting with a youth delegation. "Did you ever write a letter to someone who helped you?" he asked. "Even if they didn't know they did?" Karoline's smile dropped for a split second. Not enough for the cameras, but enough for the people watching closely. Because it wasn't an attack, it was a mirror. They weren't trying to shame her. They were trying to reach her. But Karoline didn't know how to stand in that kind of spotlight, the one that asked for vulnerability, not volume. She knew how to debate, how to win, how to out-talk. But this wasn't a contest. It was a reckoning. and it was quiet. The applause at the end of her speech was polite, respectful, but thinner than before. People weren't walking out angry. They were walking out thinking. And for someone like Caroline, whose power had always been in owning the narrative, that kind of silence was unfamiliar, unsettling. Backstage, a staffer asked if she was okay. She nodded, but her hands stayed clenched for too long, because for the first time, she realized something that couldn't be unrealized. Credentials were no longer the currency. The room was no longer buying polish. They were buying proof. And the question she'd never had to answer, who picked you up, was the only one people cared about now. She hadn't been canceled. She had been rewritten, not by outrage, but by a quiet letter read by a girl with nothing to sell and everything to remember. And Caroline couldn't stop it, because the echo didn't belong to her. It never had. By then, the headlines had moved on, the debate had cooled, and the cameras had followed noise elsewhere. But what remained wasn't a sound. It was an image. It started with a photo. No one knew who took it or where it was taken. It didn't come from a journalist or a campaign aide. It wasn't professionally edited. There was no watermark, no branding, just a quiet upload to an obscure student discussion board, the kind of corner of the internet that rarely draws attention until it does. No faces, no filters. Just a desk, the pale light of early morning falling across the scratched wood. A folded letter, creased, worn, familiar, rested gently next to a wide-ruled student notebook, its spiral edges slightly warped from use. There were no bright colors, no dramatic angle. But what caught the eye, what stopped thousands cold, was the line of pencil, written lightly but with unmistakable finality, across the top page of that notebook. Today I wrote a letter to myself. I'm not ashamed anymore. 9 words, barely a whisper, but something in their simplicity cut through the noise louder than any headline. The photo didn't go viral in the traditional sense. It didn't surge with likes or trend with hashtags. It didn't need to. It was passed by hand, one inbox to another, from teacher to student, friend to friend, a quiet chain reaction across communities that didn't need commentary to understand what they were seeing. Because people knew. They knew what it meant to sit in silence, afraid to say what you really needed. They knew what it meant to bury your own story to make others comfortable. They knew what it meant to carry shame that was never yours to begin with. And for those people, for the quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones who never raised their hand because they didn't want to be called on, the photo was a signal fire. Not a scream, not a demand, but a hand held out from the dark. Underneath the photo, someone left a comment. No name, no bio, no emojis, just a single sentence, written like a confession. Real education begins the moment someone is brave enough to ask, "Do you understand?" and stays long enough to hear the answer, instead of pretending they didn't ask. There was no argument beneath that post, no quote wars, no trolling, just silence, that rarest kind of silence online, the kind that comes when people feel, not react. In one classroom in Kansas, a teacher printed the photo and pinned it to the back wall, quietly replacing the laminated "Work Hard, Dream Big" poster that had collected dust for years. No one commented on the change, but 3 students stayed after class that week, not to ask for help on a test, but just to sit. One of them finally said, "I think I've been pretending I understand since 7th grade." The teacher didn't respond with a lesson. She just pulled up a chair and said, "Tell me where you got lost." In a juvenile detention center in Maryland, a counselor showed the image during group therapy. One boy stared at it for 10 full minutes before saying, "I never thought I could write to myself like that." The next day, they started a project called Letters We Owe Ourselves. Some wrote to their younger selves. Some wrote to their future. Some couldn't finish. But they all started. In a nursing home in Mississippi, an aide printed the photo and left it on the front desk. 2 days later, a 76-year-old retired English teacher quietly asked for a notebook. She hadn't written a letter in over 40 years. It wasn't just circulating, it was unlocking. Because this moment, this quiet revolution, sparked by a student's folded letter and a congresswoman who refused to shout back, was never about winning a debate. It was about something more enduring, more dangerous to the world that rewards Polish over truth. It was about telling people that asking doesn't mean you're broken, that not knowing doesn't make you small, that help isn't weakness, it's survival. And the notebook, the one in the photo, became more than a symbol. It became a blueprint. One teacher in Oregon rewrote her entire curriculum around it. The first page of every student's binder was no longer labeled with objectives or goals. It simply asked, "Who would you be if you didn't have to prove anything today?" In an East LA middle school, a girl taped the image to her locker door. When asked why, she shrugged and said, "It reminds me I'm allowed to start over." In a city hall in Minneapolis, a staffer printed the comment beneath the photo and taped it to the water cooler. "Do you understand?" Not just as a question, but as a dare to pause, a dare to stay, a dare to listen. Because for years, decades, entire systems had been built on the idea that if someone doesn't speak up, they must be fine. That silence meant consent. That struggle meant failure. And here, on one torn page and one sentence written in pencil, was proof that people had only stayed silent because no one ever waited long enough to hear them. This wasn't a policy shift. This wasn't a vote. This was a mirror. And in that mirror, thousands saw themselves for the first time, not as liabilities, not as gaps to be filled, but as voices that never should have been ignored in the first place. And the girl who wrote that note, no one knew her name, but her words were now etched in classrooms, therapist offices, break rooms, church bulletins, and prison rec rooms. Because she didn't write them to be quoted. She wrote them to finally tell herself the truth. And somehow that truth made room for everyone else. No one clapped, no one shouted, no one filmed it. But something in the country shifted, not from volume, but from stillness with weight. Because when someone writes, "I'm not ashamed anymore," and means it, there is nothing left for shame to hold on to. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The photo faded from timelines. The show's set was dismantled, and the microphones went cold. But the lesson didn't leave with them. It stayed. In notebooks, in breath, in bones. This wasn't just a viral moment. It wasn't a trending soundbite or a flash of sympathy. It was something far rarer, something deeper. The kind of moment that doesn't pass. It lodges. Beneath the headlines, beyond the metrics, something unspoken and ancient had surfaced. And for those who had carried silence like a second skin, that moment had a weight they'd never forget. Because what happened in that studio didn't just challenge a debate, it challenged a belief system, a hierarchy, an inherited lie. The lie that some people are born understanding. The lie that leadership only belongs to the polished. The lie that dignity must be earned in perfect grammar and uninterrupted confidence. The lie that the ones who ask for help are the ones least likely to lead. Jasmine Crockett didn't dismantle those lies by shouting them down. She dismantled them by surviving them. And that was the difference. She didn't make the audience feel sorry for her. She made them feel seen. She made them confront the question no one ever asks on a resume. No one teaches in a prep school. No one includes in a campaign ad. When you were on the ground, who lifted you? That was the crack in the armor. That was the breach in the wall. Because people realized, some of them for the first time, that the systems we call merit were never built to measure humanity. They were built to reward performance. And Jasmine didn't perform. She confessed. She testified. She told the truth with no makeup, no fanfare, no defense. And in doing so, she gave others permission to tell theirs. But that permission came at a cost. Because the truth is, Jasmine shouldn't have had to carry the burden of being both advocate and example. She shouldn't have had to relive hunger and humiliation just to be allowed a voice at the table. She shouldn't have had to bleed in public so that others could be considered fully human. That's the injustice at the heart of it. That's what makes the lesson land like a slow, clenched punch. Why does dignity have to be proven in pain? Why do the unheard always have to narrate their suffering for the world to care? No one asked Karoline Leavitt how many times she cried herself to sleep. No one needed to see her utility bill to decide if she deserved to speak. But Jasmine had to walk through every room like a courtroom, her life on trial, her tone under surveillance, her intelligence up for cross-examination, just to be heard without mockery. And still, she didn't retaliate. She didn't humiliate. She didn't weaponize her rage. She just stood there, unapologetically whole, unapologetically flawed, unapologetically present, and told a story most people only whisper to themselves. That's the lesson. That's the revolution. Not in burning systems down, but in holding space inside them. Space for brokenness, for late bloomers, for those still learning. Because somewhere along the way, we mistook intelligence for fluency. We mistook strength for silence. We mistook leadership for polish. And then a student, barely 19, sitting in the last row, rose without permission and rewrote the script. Not with power, but with paper. With a folded letter held in trembling hands that somehow never shook when she spoke. She didn't quote legislation. She didn't list degrees. She said she used to memorize multiplication tables off cereal boxes. She said she slept in a car. And she said she wasn't ashamed anymore. And that, more than any bill, any policy, any viral clip, is where the world changed. Because somewhere, someone saw themselves in her. Someone who had hidden their poverty. Someone who had smiled through food insecurity. Someone who had nodded even when they didn't understand the question. And now they knew they weren't alone. The human lesson wasn't about Jasmine. It wasn't even about the student. It was about us, all of us. How many times we've stayed quiet when we didn't know the answer? How many times we've clapped for speakers who never asked if we understood them? How many times we've mistaken confusion for failure instead of seeing it as the beginning of learning? We live in a world that teaches us to perform competence instead of cultivating comprehension. We celebrate the loudest, the quickest, the most polished, without ever asking who's still in the back of the room, scared to raise their hand. And so the lesson lives here. Education is not the possession of the prepared. It is the courage of the curious. And humanity doesn't start when you have the answers. It starts when you dare to ask the question out loud. Do you understand? And stay long enough to hear, no. That's what Jasmine did. She stayed. She stood. She let her silence speak when the moment needed silence. She let her scars testify when the room demanded proof. And she let someone else finish the story. A student, no podium, no microphone, no power, but truth. That is the legacy. Not political, not procedural, human. Because at the end of all the shouting, all the debating, all the polished lines and prepped sound bites, the question that echoes most isn't, did you win? It's, who did you make feel like they finally belonged in the room? That is the fire Jasmine lit, and no amount of silence will ever put it out. The silence changed us, but change doesn't mean anything unless it becomes action. Not just out there, but in here. Not for someone else, for you. This moment, this shift, doesn't belong to Jasmine Crockett. It doesn't belong to the student who stood. It belongs to everyone who's ever stayed quiet when they knew the answer. Everyone who's ever whispered, I don't get it, to themselves, but nodded like they did anyway. Everyone who's ever passed a test they didn't understand just to avoid looking slow. This moment belongs to you. So here's where it begins. Not with noise, not with fury, but with paper. Write a letter. Not the kind you post for likes, not the kind that performs. A letter. To the version of you who learned to shrink, to the moment you stopped asking, to the child who knew what it felt like to be embarrassed for not knowing what the others did, the one who sat through the lesson pretending to take notes while your stomach clenched, the one who started every answer with, I could be wrong, but just to brace for the blow. Write to that person, not to scold, to forgive. Tell them they were doing the best they could. Tell them that silence was a survival tactic, not a weakness. Tell them you're proud they stayed. Tell them it's okay now. You don't have to earn your right to speak. Then take another piece of paper. Write to someone who lifted you, not with a lecture, but with a pause. Not with praise, but with presence. Maybe it was a teacher, a grandmother, a stranger. Maybe they held your hand without knowing what they were holding. Maybe they said, that doesn't make you stupid, at the exact moment you needed to hear it. Maybe they just didn't walk away. Tell them, write it out. You don't need a perfect memory to thank them, just honesty, because this isn't about going viral. This is about becoming real, in your voice, in your time, in your own way. If you're a teacher, this is your moment to reframe everything. Start the next lesson with no content. Just this question. What's one thing you've pretended to know that you didn't? Then wait. Don't fill the silence. Let the room breathe. Because education isn't about how fast you get to the answer. It's about whether people feel safe enough to say they're still searching. If you're a parent, pause. Tonight at dinner, ask your child, what's something you don't understand that you're afraid to say out loud? Then listen, not to fix it, just to hear it. And if they don't answer, say, you don't have to be perfect to talk to me. If you lead a team, a classroom, a congregation, a household, use your power to slow the world down long enough to notice who's falling behind. And when they do, don't judge their pace. Sit beside them. Because people don't fail because they're dumb. People fail because they get tired of pretending. And most of the world never even stops long enough to ask why someone is falling behind. Jasmine Crockett did, and so did that student. They didn't ask for applause. They asked for honesty. They didn't ask to be right. They asked to be understood. That's what you can do now, not tomorrow. Now think of someone who has disappeared in silence. The kid in the back who never raised their hand. The colleague who never speaks up during meetings. The friend who shrinks in conversations full of acronyms. Reach out. Don't say what's wrong. Say, have you ever been asked a question and not understood it, but were too afraid to say so? Let that be your opening, then stay. Don't explain away their silence. Don't rush to translate. Sit in it with them, because the world teaches us that value is in volume. But that's a lie. Value is in vulnerability. Value is in the courage it takes to say, I didn't get it the first time, or the second, but I still want to learn. You don't have to be Jasmine to make someone feel heard. You don't have to be that student to make someone believe they're enough. You just have to show up differently and show someone else that knowledge is a bridge, not a border. If you're the one who's been silent the longest, if you're the one who still thinks your questions are interruptions, this is your invitation. You are not broken for needing more time. You are not stupid because you weren't taught the way others were. You are not alone. The most dangerous lie this world ever told is that success must be earned in silence. The truth is, silence was never consent. It was exhaustion. It was fear. It was the learned habit of disappearing before someone could tell you you didn't belong. Not anymore. Because now you know you are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to say, I'm still learning. You are allowed to start again. You are allowed to ask, will you stay while I figure this out? And if no one else will, I will. We will. Because this moment wasn't for the powerful. It was for the ones who survived long enough to speak. And now the only thing left to do is make room for more of them. So write the letter, send the message, ask the question, give someone else the mic. And if they tremble, stay anyway, because that's what this whole story was trying to teach us all along. The most revolutionary thing we can do is listen long enough for someone to feel safe saying, no, I don't understand, and stay until they do. That's your cue, not to be Jasmine, to be yourself, with your voice, your past, your questions, your courage, to stand in your truth like that student stood in the aisle, and to say, I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm ready to understand, and I'm ready to help others understand too. Now go, make the world quieter, so the voices that were once invisible can finally be heard. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.